I'm going to talk with you today about a subject that I began working on almost 40 years ago. So I apologize in advance if some of the graphics are a bit subfossil. Computers are quite a bit more sophisticated in that regard now than they were back then. This is a topic that I began on in my dissertation, so watch out, I may talk too much. The idea of the island-wide deforestation hypothesis, as many people refer to it today, was for nearly 100 years, perhaps more, the canonical view as to what happened in Madagascar with the arrival of humans and what Madagascar was like before that. There are plenty of examples in the old literature where you can read about this, mostly in French. Perrier de la Bâtie and Henri Humbert were two of the most outspoken people on this. One has to ask now, was this really the obvious explanation, or was it a convenient colonial myth? I would maintain that it was a bit of both, because when you see the landscape of nearly all of the central highlands of Madagascar today, it's this depauperate grassland, and it begs for an explanation. However, as Christian Cole and various people have pointed out in recent years, this was also a convenient colonial myth, because the gist of it was that Madagascar was covered with forest, a continuous forest throughout the island before humans arrived, and then when people came, somehow this was a very flammable environment, and people began to set it afire and completely changed the place. There are lots of corollaries to this hypothesis. One of them is that this can conveniently also explain the demise of the megafauna of Madagascar. So let's examine this a little. What it amounts to is that even well before anybody examined this in detail in the fossil record or any other scientific way, there were some early dissenting voices, some archaeologists and botanists. For instance, Bob Dewar mentioned this in a 1984 paper, and he said, our knowledge of the original plant cover is largely conjectural. However, and Copeland, 1972, for example, has raised doubts about the commonly held assumption that the now denuded and eroded plateau regions were once completely forested. It's interesting to read Copeland's paper. This botanist expressed a lot of amazement that when you examine certain plant species, certain trees in particular in the highlands, they seem to have what are interpreted elsewhere as clear adaptations for surviving fire. And yet, if fire has only been a factor in the environment for a matter of a few centuries or a couple of millennia, it's hard to imagine how all of that could have evolved that fast. So it really began about 1984 when I had the opportunity as a paleoecologist, a graduate student working in Dan Livingston's lab at Duke University, to actually go there and take some cores, do pollen analysis, charcoal analysis, and things of that sort, and examine this hypothesis with some actual information. We first published with Ross McPhee and Neil Wells just a couple of pollen spectra in association with a lot of other information about the remarkable fossil site of Amphisamba zimba. And what we saw there was, instead of pre-human pollen record of continuous forest, that there appears to have been a variety of plant communities in that area, not all of which were really forest. If you look here on the right side of this diagram, you can see a synoptic pollen diagram showing that indeed 1,500 years ago there was a lot less grass pollen than later, and a lot of pollen of woody plants. However, if you look at that white zone through the middle, these are plants that are not really forest trees. They're mostly herbs and shrubs associated with more open environments. And as you can see, that community seems to persist throughout the record. The other thing that I saw in this very early look was here at Lake Cavita, very near Ambazemba, that there was charcoal early on, indicating fires, but there did seem to be an increase after human arrival. If we had not looked any farther, we probably would have concluded that Humbert and period of the Bati were actually probably more or less on track. However, when you actually look at the pollen diagram, what immediately jumps out at you is there are a number of taxa here, and you can, I know you can't perhaps see this clearly, but you can study this on your screen a bit, or you can actually look up the old 1987 paper, which is posted on the website for this workshop. You'll see that there are a number of taxa here, woody taxa and so forth, that are actually characteristic of more open environments. One of the things that I did was to look at a lot of modern environments, looking at the sediment just on the surface and comparing it with Landsat data and aerial photographs, vegetation maps, and classifying the modern vegetation, and then taking the pollen spectra and through PCA ordination to actually get some idea of how in character space these pre-human pollen spectra or early human pollen spectra would cluster with modern environments. And again, you have to study this up close, but the gist of it is in all 6 of these pairwise combinations of the first 4 axes of principal components, what we see here is that these pollen spectra did not cluster with closed forest of the eastern type or anything of that sort, but in fact clustered generally with places like Lake Meharry in the north, where we have a kind of woodland savanna mosaic type environment, very typical of much of Africa at the same latitudes. So this set us to thinking about all this, and of course the question that immediately arose was, what if you look farther back, say look at the entire Holocene? So another lake, a crater lake in the highlands, Lake Tretrivikele, became the site that we investigated, and since that time other groups have recorded the site and confirmed what I found, and actually gotten a much longer record because they have better equipment. What we see here clearly is that throughout the Holocene, the last 11,000 years, there was a lot of grass at this site. There was also a lot of shrub type vegetation, the montane shrub type habitats with the ericaceae, and also that, ironically, many trees seem to increase in the late Holocene, probably in response to increased wetness in the environment, increased precipitation, and that, in fact, the recent spectra on the site are really not very different from what you see earlier on, presumably well before humans. Well, what about the important corollary to this idea that it was continuous forests and then people came and messed everything up, was that there was a great deal of burning involved. And so I looked at stratigraphic distribution of microscopic charcoal particles, and what I actually saw in a place like Tretrivikele was that, in fact, there was more charcoal in the sediments in the early Holocene and mid-Holocene than after that time. This really flew in the face of what a lot of people expected me to find, and so I measured charcoal, as you can see here, many different ways. Looking at the percent of the dry weight in the sediments, looking at the influx of charcoal, looking at the concentration of charcoal, and also looking at the portion of the charcoal which was graminoid, that is, derived from burning grasses, versus woody types of charcoal. And what you see here in the column on the right of the first diagram is that a very high percentage of the charcoal throughout the record was from graminoids, about 75% generally. And in fact, there were times in the early Holocene when there was more charcoal in the sediments than there is today. The other thing I did to try to calibrate this a bit was to look at these modern pollen spectra I collected around the central highlands and other environments and compared to the modern vegetation. And again, what we see is a lot of charcoal in all environments except very dense humid forests, such as in the eastern part of the island. So that didn't leave the original hypothesis a lot of leg to stand on, but the people did point out, well, that's just the Holocene. Maybe people were there throughout the entire Holocene. We just didn't know it. And ironically, the archaeologists recently and people working in a southern site called Christmas River have shown evidence for human modified Aepyornis bones going back about 11,000 years. But what about the Pleistocene? Well, we had a site on the edge of the forest in the Montagne d'Amber in the far north, and what you see in this one, which was a dystrophic bog, meaning there was not a lot of sediment at all in the Holocene, was that in fact there was more charcoal in this site, deposited in the sediments of this site, in the Pleistocene, going all the way back to about 36,000 years than any time in the Holocene. Well, what else can we then tease out of this? One of the things that is to look at connections between a proxy indicator for the megafauna, which is Sporomiella spores. This is a coprophilous fungus spore. It's a dung inhabiting fungus. It's often taken around the world as a proxy for the presence of megafauna. And what you see in these diagrams is that generally speaking in the highlands and in the southwest and many other areas that there's a lot of Sporomiella until about 2,000 years ago, and then it declines. And in some of these sites, we actually see a big jump in charcoal after that. You see several examples of that here, including in the lower left, a couple of sites in much wetter areas. Benavuni is in the Sambarano rainforest, and Pari Bay is on Nussi Bay. And here you see there's not a whole lot of evidence for megafauna before humans, but there's some increase that's probably associated with the arrival of humans with cattle and corresponding increase in charcoal as well. So this raised some interesting possibilities that invited a kind of modeling exercise. And this is a very, very simple box model. I'm sure I could draw little arrows and circles going all over the place here to make it more complex, but it's actually a very simple idea. What I suggested in the synergy hypothesis, which I published in 1999, first time, is perhaps people arrived in Madagascar, and because, as I am inferring, there were these open savannas in the highlands and so forth, the megafauna was fairly vulnerable. After all, remember, the megafauna had not seen people before, so they probably behaved like the penguins in Antarctica or the tortoises in the Galapagos. They had no fear of humans, so they were pretty easily hunted out. The result of that, and we've seen this in other places around the world, is a reduction in herbivory, which results in a great accumulation of plant biomass, which then leads to increased fire incidence, converting this mosaic to simpler communities. And I suggest that a combination of these human impacts driven by this synergistic interaction, along with climate change and also biological invasion, which must have played a role, could then finish off the megafauna. There was one remaining question that I really wanted to get at and had no luck for many years in dealing with, and that was to find fossil sites deep enclosed forests. The problem, of course, is these are acid environments, and so what you wind up with is a lot of dissolution of bones, hard to find good fossil sites. So we weren't really finding that until we began working in a place called Bianca out in the west. That's the star on the inset map. Bianca is a kind of karst topography, but not as eroded and rough as most of the Singi of the west. And in this dense forest that's found here in an otherwise open area, very dense forest on this site. We found a cave, Anjui Gidrobe, the giant lemur cave, we named it, in the Bianca protected area, where we found lots and lots of fossil megafauna. And guess what? This rich fossil record showed that there were no hippos, no tortoises, or elephant birds found in this very rich site. Instead, there was a prevalence of sloth lemurs. These are like the one you see being taken by an eagle here, a hawk eagle in the upper right. Sloth lemurs were sort of gibbon-like, suspensory feeders hanging in the trees, a little bit like a sloth, and obviously not well adapted to life on the ground. I thought this was a particularly interesting finding because it suggests, in fact, that perhaps the hippos and tortoises and elephant birds and so forth were the typical savanna species, megafaunal species, and of course Megalatopus and Archaeolemur and some of these others appear to have spent some time on the ground. But in fact, the dense forest never had the typical megafauna. In fact, they may have had mostly these sloth lemurs that we found at Bianca. Well, I have to get off here. I've talked too long, but the gist of it is we have to ask the question, does Madagascar have any rewilding potential? Because we're looking for some possible practical use for these findings. And I would maintain that it does, because in fact, it suggests that if we brought back the giant tortoises, which we can do because one of the two giant tortoise species survived on Aldabra Atoll, and if we brought them back, I suppose we could make a case for bringing back some other things, at least in a fenced sort of environment, such as ratites and hippos, that indeed we might see a reemergence of this savanna type environment, which was not just, we think, a pure grassland, but in fact a kind of non-analog environment that included a lot of species that were adapted to grazing and fire. So I'll leave it with that, and I thank you for your attention. I thank Leanne Phelps for inviting me to speak at this thing, and I apologize for talking too long, but I warned you that I would. Iluma.